morning. My name is Ruti Lijan, and I am the Vice Chair of the Committee on Housing and Community Development. At the request of Councilor Kendra Lara, the Chair of the Committee on Housing and Community Development, I will be conducting this hearing this morning. I want to remind you that this public hearing is being recorded and broadcast live on Xfinity 8, RCN 82, and FiOS 964, and streamed on www.boston.gov/city-council-tv, and will also be rebroadcast at a later date. Please silence your cell phones and other devices. We will also take public testimony and ask that you sign in to testify or to register your attendance. Anyone that would like to testify virtually on this matter, please email juan.lopez@boston.gov. That's JUAN.LOPEZ@boston.gov with your full name for the Zoom link. At the start of your testimony, please state your name, address, and affiliation. Today's hearing is on dockets number 0536, number 0537, and number 0708. These matters are sponsored by the mayor and were referred to the Committee on Housing and Community Development, dockets number 0536 and number 0537 on April 27, 2022, and docket number 0708 on June 8, 2022. Read the docket summaries. So the docket summaries for docket summaries for 0536 and 0537, an order authorizing the City of Boston to apply for, accept, and expend Federal Fiscal Year 2022 Housing and Community Development funds from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, and an order authorizing the City of Boston Mayor's Office of Housing to accept and expend funds from the Inclusionary Development Policy Fund. And then docket 0708, an order authorizing the City of Boston Mayor's Office of Housing to apply for, accept, and expend funds from the Home Investment Partnership Program, American Rescue Plan Act of 2021, Home ARP, from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. I am joined by my colleagues here, Council President Ed Flynn from District 2. I don't know if there's anything you'd like to share on this matter, President Flynn, but if you would, now is the time.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the important work you've been doing on housing issues. Also want to say thank you to the administration staff that is here for their important work as well. I have no further comments, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd also just like to read again, just so that we have it fully on the record what these dockets are. Docket number 0536, message and order authorizing the Mayor's Office of Housing to accept and expend payment in the amount of $40 million given from the City of Boston's Inclusionary Development Policy Fund for the purpose of producing and preserving affordable housing in the City of Boston. Docket number 0537, message and order authorizing the City of Boston to apply for, accept, and expend the Federal Fiscal Year 2022 Housing and Community Development Funds from the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development. This order includes the following grant programs with final awards estimated not to exceed the totals listed: Community Development Block Grant, $18 million, Home Investment Partnership Program, $7 million, Housing Opportunities for Persons with AIDS, $4 million, and the Emergency Solutions Grant, $2 million. And docket number 0708, message and order authorizing the City of Boston, acting through the Mayor's Office of Housing, to apply for, accept, and expend the amount of $21,597,797 provided under the Home Investment Partnership Program, American Rescue Plan Act of 2021 from the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development. The purpose of the Home ARP funds is to provide housing to individuals, to households who are homeless, at risk of homelessness, and other vulnerable populations in the City of Boston. I thank the members of the administration for being here, both in person and virtually, and I ask that you introduce yourselves, name, title, and affiliation, and then we can begin the presentation and testimony, starting with docket number 0536 and following with docket number 0537 and 0708.
Thank you. I am Tim Davis. I'm the Deputy Director for Policy Development and Research at the Mayor's Office of Housing, and I'll pass it over to Rick.
Good morning. Rick Wilson, Deputy Director for Administration and Finance at the Mayor's Office of Housing.
Awesome. And do we have any folks with us virtually?
We do. I'll have them introduce themselves. However, actually, I'll just say they're here for questions. They're not going to be testifying directly, but we have Danielle Johnson, the Deputy Director for the Office of Housing Stability, Richard O'Brien, who is from the Boston Home Center, and Christine O'Keefe, representing the Neighborhood Housing Division.
Great, thank you so much. So you can begin with your presentation, and at the end, I will invite my council colleague in the singular, to ask any questions. But thank you for being here.
Okay. Thank you, Councilor Louis-Jean and Councilor Flynn, Council President Flynn, for having us here today and your time. I'll start the presentation now. If it's up over there. Okay. I have it on. Let's see. It's not. Okay, which way it's not going? I did. There we go. Okay, thank you. Every year, the City of Boston, receives grants from the Department of Housing and Urban Development from the following programs. Community Development Block Grant, which this year would be $17.3 million. Home Investment Partnerships, $6.4 million. Emergency Solutions Grants, $1.5 million. And Housing Opportunities for Persons with AIDS, or HOPWA, for $3.4 million. To look at both specifically at the CDBG funds first. The CDBG funds are administered by MOH and is the primary administrative agency for the city's CDBG allocation. MOH subgrants a portion of the CDBG allocation to these city departments. $435,000 to fair housing and equity, $2.6 million to workforce development, and just under $4 million to economic opportunity and inclusion. Eligible activities include housing rehab, economic development, social services, and public facilities. The primary uses that we do is housing, including homebuyer education, down payment assistance, and housing rehab, social services, rental housing development, and economic development programs, including Main Streets, Restore, facade assistance, small business assistance, and neighborhood business loans. All CDBG funds are to be used for activities serving households with incomes at a CDBG defined 80% of median income, which is currently $100,700 for a family of 3 or less, or in a geographic area where at least 51% of the households have incomes under that threshold. The second source of funds is home. The Mayor's Office of Housing administers all home funds. It's used for housing, construction, and rehab, and operating support for community development corporations. The primary uses are the production of new affordable rental and homeownership housing and operating support for those CDCs. There's also income targeting for home funds. They must be used to provide housing for households with incomes under 80% of the Boston metropolitan area, median family income, and for rental housing, at least 90% of the units must serve households with incomes up to 60% of the median income. The third source is the ESG funds. These are also administered by our office. They may be used for 5 program components: street outreach, emergency shelter, homelessness prevention, rapid rehousing, and the Homeless Management Information System, or HMIS. ESG funds may only be used for persons who are homeless or at risk of becoming homeless as defined by HUD. Participants seeking assistance under the homelessness prevention component must have income below 30% of area median income, which is currently $37,850 for a family of 3. The targeted populations include chronically homeless individuals and families, families with children, veterans and their families, and unaccompanied youth. The fourth form of funding from HUD we get annually is HOPWA. And the Mayor's Office of Housing also administers these funds, but not only for the City of Boston, but for all of Norfolk, Plymouth, and Suffolk counties. Eligible activities include construction or rehab of housing for persons with HIV/AIDS, tenant-based rental assistance, supportive services, housing information services, permanent housing placement services, short-term rent, mortgage and utility assistance, and technical assistance. Our primary uses are tenant-based rental assistance, short-term mortgage, rental, and utility assistance, housing information and counseling services, and permanent housing placement. They must primarily be used for households with HIV, AIDS, and incomes up to 80% of the metropolitan area income. This next slide gives you an idea of kind of how we spend the funds across different program areas. So home repair, letting, homebuyer assistance is $6.3 million. That's all from CDBG. Development and preservation of affordable housing, we use both CDBG and home dollars. Homelessness prevention, housing resources, and street outreach, we use CDBG, ESG, and HOPWA funds. Small business relies exclusively on CDBG. Workforce development, CDBG. Public facilities, including grassroots, the Partners with Nonprofits program, and property management, and fair housing all also rely exclusively on CDBG funds. It's also important to note that of the CDBG funds, only 15% can be used for services as opposed to other programs like public facilities and housing. For the second set of funds we'll talk about today is our other batch of HUD funds. This is one-time funding from HUD under the American Rescue Plan, which was signed into law in March of 2021. To address the need for homelessness assistance and supportive services, Congress appropriated $5 billion in American Rescue Plan funds to be administered through HOME to perform 4 activities that must primarily benefit qualifying individuals and families who are homeless, at risk of homelessness, or in other vulnerable populations. We are receiving a one-time $21.6 million allocation. These funds can be used up through September of 2030. These activities include development and support of affordable housing, tenant-based rental assistance, provision of supportive services, and acquisition and development of non-congregate shelter units. It can be used for qualified populations, including the homeless, those experiencing homelessness, at risk of homelessness, those who are fleeing or attempting to flee, domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, or human trafficking, as defined by HUD, and other populations who are at risk of being homeless or of housing instability, including those up to 50% of area median income that meets one of 7 housing instability criteria. Veterans are specifically called out as eligible for this programming, although they must meet other eligibility criteria as other participants. We have gone through a consultation process, including 2 public hearings on these funds, as well as focus group meetings with our continuum of care, domestic violence providers, veterans groups, disability groups, fair housing groups, the Boston Housing Authority, and other voucher issuing agency, in this case, Metro Boston Housing. We have decided to propose that HomeArt will be used for the following programmatic areas: $3.5 million for supportive services, $6.5 million for tenant-based rental assistance, and this is primarily to help those who've had rapid rehousing under shorter-term programs to keep them in that housing longer as we find them permanent housing. Development of affordable rental housing, in this case, permanent supportive housing specifically. Nonprofit capacity building is $1 million. I skipped over. Development of affordable rental housing is $9 million. Nonprofit capacity building of $1 million. And administration and planning of $1.6 million, which is 7.5% of the grant, when we are allowed to take up to 15% of the grant for admin and planning. Now, to complete with our the final docket number, the IDP funds. The Inclusionary Development Policy Funds, a request to accept and expend up to $40 million. IDP funds are generated when a developer pays into the fund instead of creating units on site or as a partial unit payment. Partial unit payments are made at the time of the building permit. Otherwise, for condominiums, 1/4 of the minimum payment is paid at building permit, the remainder of the minimum at certificate of occupancy, and a true-up based on actual sales price 1 year after the certificate of occupancy. For rental, 7 equal annual payments starting at the building permit. The Mayor's Office of Housing has managed the IDP fund since FY 2015. Previously, it was managed by the BRA, the then BRA. Eligible activities include creation of new long-term affordable housing units. Units can be home ownership, rental, cooperative, or other forms of permanent or transitional housing. All affordable units will be subject to an affordable housing restriction. The income targeting is in line with the overall IDP policy, in that the maximum rental income is 70% of AMI, and for ownership, it is at least half the units at or below 80% of AMI, and the remainder can be up to 100% of AMI. I'm going to ask Rick Wilson to discuss the revenues and expenditures.
Thanks, Tim. Councilors, as Tim mentioned, Mayor's Office of Housing has been managing the IDP fund since FY15. At that time, BPDA transferred $21.5 million to MOH. That was what was available in the fund. And since then, we've collected $126.6 million of IDP payments. It averages out to about $16 million over the past 8 years. We expect to collect an additional $29.3 million in FY23, which would result in total revenue, IDP revenue, of $177.4 million through the end of next fiscal year. On the expenditure side, we do spend a small percentage of IDP funds for program management, about $8 million since FY15 through next fiscal year. We have awarded $142.4 million to housing projects since FY15, and we project an additional $28.4 million in commitments in next fiscal year for total expenditures of $178.8 million. You'll note that the expenditures are higher than the revenue. Of course, we would not let that happen. These are projections. We will monitor between now and the next fiscal year to ensure that we have enough revenue to cover all of our commitments. The projection does include projects that are in the pipeline. Some of those might get pushed out a year. Numbers might change. If necessary, we will shift projects to an alternative eligible source to make sure that we're staying on budget, obviously. And I'll kick it back to...
Yeah, and I think it's important to state that this request for accept and expenditure of $40 million is for the purposes of allowing us to get future income. This isn't money that's necessarily sitting in the bank now. This is money that we anticipate coming in over the next 2 years so that we would be able to, as it came in, we would be able to spend it quickly.
Thank you, Tim.
And just to wrap up, just to give a few examples of projects that have been funded recently by the IDP Fund. The rental housing, Residences off Baker, which is in West Roxbury. It's the first new 100% income restricted development in West Roxbury in almost 10 years, with 60 income restricted units for families. We have under the Acquisition Opportunity Program, which we know is a favorite of many of the counselors. The Vertulo building is one example in Hyde Park. It was acquired in March and preserved in perpetuity through AOP. It has 5 retail spaces and 4 apartments, of which 3 are income restricted. This also is actually kind of really a wealth building exercise as well for the family that has purchased this building. It also has one of the businesses on the first floor. And then the third one is Fountain Hill Condos in Roxbury. That's 40 new income restricted condos. And then finally, also kind of a popular program is the Neighborhood Homes Initiative. This is just a picture of 12 Roxon Street in Dorchester. It's a new 2-family on former city-owned lots. Both units are income restricted. And so those are just some recent examples. And we are complete with our presentation. And so if you have any questions, we are ready. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that presentation, Tim. I am excited to hear about the work that the Mayor's Office of Housing is doing. I care deeply about this work as an attorney who's represented folks facing eviction and foreclosure and worked with folks facing displacement. So I'm excited. And I'm also really excited. I didn't know that it was through AOP funds that Byron and Nakia, of Intriguing Hair, were able to buy that property in Hyde Park, but they're great, and I'm excited that the city was able to do that. I want to see us do a lot more of that, which is why I am a super big fan of AOP. How do we prevent displacement? How do we create wealth opportunities to grow wealth in our Black and brown communities? And we know ownership is an important part of that. So excited. I have questions, but I'm going to first turn it over to President Flynn in case he has questions that he'd like to ask.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to the panelists for the presentation. And I certainly support this proposal. I had 2 questions. Maybe Tim, I could start with you. I know you highlighted the opportunity, a potential opportunity for housing for veterans. I'd love to see some housing in my district for veterans and military families. Is this something we can work on? Are there anything in the pipeline that you might see that there's an opportunity in District 2, whether it's in the South End or downtown Boston, South Boston? But is there an opportunity for us to get more veteran housing?
I am, thank you for that question. I'm not aware of anything at this time. I know that if any, Christine O'Keefe has put up her hand, she might be able to give us some feedback on that question.
Okay.
Yes, thank you, Tim. We are having active conversations with the vet shelter. We are actually looking at doing some renovations and adding some additional beds at the vet shelter on Court Street. And we are actually working with them on the AOP program to see if there's some potential triple deckers or 6 families out there that they might be interested in as well. So we probably speak with them at least once a month.
Okay, thank you, Christine. I appreciate that response. I know the center recently received $1 million from HUD, and I was talking to Congressman Lynch about it, and so the congressman mentioned that he'd like to do a visit to the New England Center with the mayor sometime this summer, so maybe that's something we could coordinate, and I already talked with the New England Center, so let's talk about maybe having a visit there sometime in, maybe July or August, so we can work with your office. So thank you for the important work you're doing. And I guess my final question. I know you mentioned housing for people living with HIV and AIDS. I think that's an outstanding outreach program. It's special to me. That's the issue Mayor Flynn has worked on when he was mayor, is housing for people living with HIV, AIDS, and domestic violence survivors as well. So just want to acknowledge the important work that we're doing to help people living with HIV, AIDS, and women survivors of domestic violence. Are you working with any domestic violence programs to kind of coordinate that type of outreach? And the reason I ask is I do some work with the Asian Task Force Against Domestic Violence, and one of the things they have highlighted to me certainly is language access is a critical issue. Immigration is also a critical issue, but they also highlighted lack of housing opportunities for survivors because they just don't have the financial means to leave their spouse or significant other and go to a place. So is there an opportunity for, women that may have difficulty with, it might be the language or with immigration-related issues or financial issues? Are we able to help those survivors?
Yeah. Thank you, Counselor, for that question. It's a very important one. The Home Art Funds specifically call out as a qualified population those people who are victims of domestic violence. And so we are called by that funding to really kind of stretch ourselves a little more than we have with that working and helping that population. And they are certainly would be part of the kind of eligible populations for any of those activities. One thing as part of this process of creating the allocation plan for HUD, which is not completed at this point, but will be soon, would not only do we have to reach out to domestic violence providers, but also we need to include data on need within that allocation plan. And what we're finding is that there isn't as much data on this problem as we would like. So we are also proposing using some of the admin funds from the Home ARP to actually fund someone to do some work around data and to give us a better lay of the land so that we know, not only what we're doing with these funds, but what we're doing going further out in addressing those folks who have domestic violence problems in their lives.
Yeah, thank you for that answer, and thank you for that response. I think that is critical to get the data and to review it so you can make the best decision possible. Tim, can you include in that outreach the language and communication access, just to make sure we're also reaching survivors that may not speak English, just to make sure that we include them in these studies and that they're their, you know, their message or their opinion is heard.
Certainly,
Okay.
certainly, certainly.
Madam Chair, I have no further comments or questions. Just want to say thank you to you, Madam Chair, and say thank you to the panelists.
Thank you, President Flynn. I have a few questions, well, a little bit more than a few, so thank you for being here. My first question is the allocation from HUD for the CDBG grants of the amount of $17 million. Apologies if you did go over this, but how is that allocation determined?
We have CDBG funds we've received since 1975, I believe, and so you could say that we have had a strong track record of using the funds for certain programs each year, and up and down a little bit based on the availability of funds. We use all of the public service cap, for example, on those service programs such as fair housing, OWD, and so but we try to use as much of it as possible for housing development as possible, like we do for most of our funds. We do have to have 2 public hearings each year, one on the draft plan and one on the final plan, which we have held those hearings. So we do get input each year on those. And that's for our annual action plan, which we have a 5-year consolidated plan, and then we have an action plan for each year thereafter. This year was the last year of our action plans. Next year, we will have to submit a full consolidated plan again, and then we will go through a much more thorough vetting with the community than we do with the annual plan.
Okay, are there ways to get more money from HUD? It's just like, or is there, it's like, this is the allocation, this is what they set?
Yes, it's based on a formula, and this is one place where, you know, the outcomes of the census kind of can hurt us. Is on these kind of funds. This is one reason why it's so important that we were trying to push to get people to answer the census, because this is one of the areas where it affects us, is all of these HUD funds.
Right.
And the amount of the funds, I mean, it's been, you know, flat or even declining for many years. I think our award this year is about the same as it was 20 years ago. So the overall federal funding for the program has not in any way kept pace with inflation or the need.
Which is doubly unfortunate, because I think a lot of us know that there was an undercount in this last census in a lot of our transient populations and our immigrant communities. And so I wonder, and I've asked this question to different departments, has there been or was there any advocacy to the administration, the federal administration, about, you know, we believe that these numbers don't accurately represent our city, and therefore these numbers are not going to be, you know, our allocation may be significantly less than what we actually need because of the census undercount?
It is, I can't speak for the administration fully in this count, but I do believe that there will be an attempt to challenge the numbers if it's not already underway.
Okay, and that could that result in an increase in the allocation under the community development block grants?
It could, because the one thing that we can't challenge is the number for redistricting. In other words, you know, what we did for redistricting is done. But I think for purposes such as these other federal programs, I think it would actually change the numbers for us. Great.
And so you list here the limitations on CDBG, that what they must be primarily used for. But does HUD otherwise restrict the programmatic uses of the funds once you receive it, other than like the income targeting?
There are some very specific, there's a whole entire grid of different uses that you can use it for and things you can't use it for. So we can use it for some housing counseling, but we can't use it for other purposes. I mean, it's just, you have to, it's a grid, and I'm happy to sit down with you someday and kind of go over the grid and talk about that.
And so has the Mayor's Office of Housing found it to be restrictive in terms of how, like, the areas where we have to depend on our own city dollars for, yeah?
Yeah, I would say, you know, either geographically or for income targeting, we have to look at other city funding, like the Housing 2030 Special Appropriation, to supplement the CDBG and the home funding for our housing and homelessness programs.
Is it primarily around income targeting? The restrictions?
Income targeting is not usually our problem.
Okay.
It's usually around what actually you can use the funds for, or other issues within the implementation of using the funds. For example, you have to have an environmental review for every project that you work on, and yet for some of our projects where we're trying to move quickly, like AOP, it doesn't work for AOP because we're trying to get a building purchased quickly, and the environmental review wouldn't have been able to be done in that process. So we could go back, if we were putting money in later, we could do an environmental review and then put the money in. but that provides a problem for us in terms of using the money quickly.
Yeah. So none of CDBG money has been used for AOP?
No,
Okay.
no. Also, CDBG funds cannot be used for projects being done by for-profit developers, even if we've got a cap on what profits they can make. They can only be used for nonprofit developers.
And I think AOP the uses have been primarily CDCs and community land trust who have been able to take advantage of AOP.
Primarily, although we have had a couple of for-profit owners who've been able to use those funds as well, including the Vitrullo building.
Okay, right, okay. All right, thank you for those answers. My next question is on the restrictions placed on the emergency solutions grant. What are the, just a general overview of what we can use that money for and what the restrictions are?
It is for households making less than 30% of area median income, so it's significantly lower. These funds are used almost entirely for two different programs. It's used for street outreach through Pine Street, and each year it's used for the Office of Housing Stability, for homelessness prevention to 3 existing programs, including providing assistance to low-income constituents at risk of homelessness, including both elders and families, as well as direct financial assistance to stabilize tenancies or help displaced tenants relocate. So it's very much kind of emergency funding for those families. It's not used for housing development.
And who are our partners? Who our partners tend to be when we receive this money and then we work with organizations that are doing the work? Who do they tend to be?
Let's see if I have that.
So the street outreach, I know, is Pine Street
Right.
Inn. I'm looking to Danielle. Do you have in front of you the contractors, recipients for the ESG funding from Office of Housing Stability?
Sure. So I believe Kyle, I believe, is also in the
right.
audience and may be able to add additions to this. But we coordinate with NOAA, Project Hope, AACA. Kyle, if I'm missing anything else, please let me know. Those are the 3 that we mainly coordinate with for emergency funding. So what we call our flex funds for the Office of Housing Stability. But I'm not sure if Kyle, if you want to add.
No.
He says we're good.
Kyle's giving the thumbs up.
Okay.
Thank you, Danielle.
And does the use of this grant require documentation in terms of that we send documentation back to HUD in terms of who the recipients are? Like, do they need to be lawfully admitted permanent? Do they need to be lawfully admitted permanent residents, or like things of like that? What do they require of us to?
We absolutely have to report back to HUD and maintain documentation, or at least our vendors do. Again, I'm looking at Danielle to see if she knows more about the kind of immigration status question.
Kyle's saying no.
Kyle's saying no. No.
No, so it's
On
just a
immigration
blanket
status.
use on anyone who has, when we determine as a city how we target that emergency solutions grant. It seems like the restrictions are not as, it's more malleable than the CDBG, well, than the CDBG grant.
Yeah, it is. Thank you.
Great. I think I have a few questions on ARPA. So you stated that, and just to be clear, this funding that we're approving is separate from the ARPA funds that's before the city council, the $350 million. This is a targeted specific allocation from HUD regarding like housing that.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
Yeah, the American Rescue Plan Act included a specific appropriation to the home program to HUD. The rest of the ARPA funding is going straight from the U.S. Treasury Department, and that's all being managed by the city budget office.
Great. The $3.5 million for supportive services, can you talk a bit about what that looks like, who that's going to, what the work is going to be there?
Right. We're still developing that, but let me get to the kinds of programming we think it would be for. It would be housing counseling, housing search, importantly, because we think this would be paired with people who are on rapid rehousing vouchers and need to find something more permanent. Mental health services, outreach services, substance abuse treatment services, case management, landlord and tenant liaison. There's a fairly wide range of services it can be for. We are still developing the kind of details of those funds. And these funds can be used all the way up till 2030. So we do have some, of all the federal funds we've gotten through the federal allocations, this is the one that gives us the longest timeline to work with.
Great. And so this is $21.6 million. We're still developing, so nothing is like set in stone, but this is money that the city has subject to our approval.
Correct.
The city has to do all of this work that, has not yet come before the council or that we've not yet considered in budget hearings or anything like that.
It would not be considered in budget hearings because it is outside of the normal budget process.
Right, so this is $21.6 million to do this targeted work, in a way that is completely and wholly separate from the mayor's vision for the ARPA dollars. And so this is one-time funding that we have not received before, that we're receiving now. We probably won't get it again next year. Yeah. So it's an opportunity for us to do work in areas where we otherwise wouldn't have the funding.
Correct. And although it is not part and parcel of the regular ARPA funding, Rick is a master at juggling all the balls and saying, okay, we can fund this with the ARPA money and this with Home ARP and this with CDBG, CV. And so, for example, the money for constructing housing is actually going to probably be for permanently supportive housing, but it could be for projects that could receive one of several funding sources, but it's the one that that this works the best for.
Any ideas of anything that we're doing uniquely with this allocation that we haven't been able to do with other, like supporting, I'm thinking about supporting entities and groups that otherwise, for whatever reason, aren't able to penetrate, ARPA funds, aren't able to, are not the usual actors that we see in these spaces?
I'll start. One thing is that the money for nonprofit capacity building is actually funds that could help us work with folks that that do need capacity building to kind of enter this space and work in this space more often. And also, the supportive services funding is helping us to fill gaps because it's one thing to build permanent supportive housing. One of the hard parts is funding some of the services that goes with that. And some of that funding would help to do that kind of work.
Great, thank you. I'm just going to give a plug for there's some organizations that I think that are doing really great supportive services work when it comes to our formerly incarcerated residents. Justice for Housing, which has been working very closely with the Boston Housing Authority, which is led by a formerly incarcerated person herself. It's one thing, and they've had an allocation from the city of Boston for the city-based housing vouchers to help those returning citizens find housing, but there's also a lot of need for support and assistance in that process. And so they've been doing incredible work on a shoestring budget, and I think it's really important for us to be intentional and think about the organizations that aren't always like, the gadflies or the folks that we know all the time that are doing the work that need our support as well. And especially because this is one-time funds, I think maybe it sounds like there may be more flexibility here than there is in other streams of funding that we get. So I'd like to see us, and this is the first time, that it's before the council. So I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that. And also supporting, community land trusts that are doing a lot of active work to get more funding into AOP and to build out statewide models for AOP when we're talking about preventing displacement. I think, AOP, that's why it's such an incredible program, because I think it is probably one of the best and potentially one of the most cost-effective ways of ensuring that tenants aren't being displaced. Cost-effective to a certain, there's a cliff point, of course, but so, if there's flexibility here for AOP, it's something that I know a lot of the councilors really support as well. And then I think you mentioned this already, Tim, but I think you stated that when you said that there's exclusive money, I think it was it's maybe in CDBG for fair housing. Does that mean fair housing is wholly funded via CDBG and not through any other city dollars?
I'm not sure what their budget is from the city operating budget. However, they do also get funding from specific HUD grants that are specifically fair housing related. Traditionally, we have funded them at about $200,000 to $250,000 a year, and a couple of years ago.
Through CDBG? Through
CDBG, and we upped that to this number a couple of years ago and have maintained that because we felt it was really important for their work in hiring investigators and also hiring external partners that would do testing.
Okay. And so, one last question on ARP, and I think this is the one that I thought you spoke to. It seems like nonprofit capacity is the smallest percentage of the home ARP funding of the $1 million or 4.6%. Like, how do we choose that amount? Obviously, it's something that my office cares about deeply, that we care about building out that. And you spoke to it too, so you care about it as well.
Right. So I would say that it's actually the maximum we can do is 5% of the grant.
And that's under the federal regulations?
Under the regulations. 5% is the maximum we can do for capacity, and we're at 4.6%, and the maximum is 5%.
And just to clarify too, the capacity, I mean, the nonprofits, they have to be nonprofits that are working in the other home ARP funded areas. It can't be something that's totally unrelated to the other activities that are being funded by the home ARP.
Okay.
Correct.
So for example, if I, for either I have a nonprofit, the home run nonprofit that gets $2 million from the development of affordable rental housing to actually do that development, they could then get like a tranche of the $1 million for the administrative.
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct. That's
Okay.
absolutely correct.
And how many nonprofits do you envision us being able to support with this $1 million capacity? What have we done in the past?
I think it's a maximum of 75,000 each, so I'll just do the quick math, and
That's about 12.5?
13.3.
13.3, there you go, okay. Okay, great. I think those are all my questions that don't relate to the IDP request.
Okay.
But I guess my first question is, do we have a timeline for the codification of IDP?
We currently have a consultant who is working on that. We actually had the first meeting of the Technical Advisory Committee, which is a group of CDCs, developers, and community members last week. We anticipate that report will be finished sometime in the fall, and we would hope to be able to come back before the council with a recommendation towards the end of the year.
Okay, what is, so there's an outside consultant that the technical advisory group, they report, I guess, to the technical advisory group. What is the role of the technical advisory group in, offering, like, what are they able to do? What are they empowered to do in the process?
Right, I mean, they are advisory in nature. They are to help guide the process of the actual feasibility study. So for example, it's part of the questions that we had last week were questions about what are the methodology, because there's a couple of different ways to look at feasibility in terms of how land costs are and how you assess the values. So there was a fairly fruitful discussion around the methodology. And so, again, that's mostly about what the study looks like, what kind of data they're using, how are they getting data. They will come back to the group with preliminary findings, and the consultant will create a report of recommendations to the city, but then the city will take those recommendations and may make different recommendations than the consultant based on the data that they have and or what they think is best for the city before the recommendations are then, the official first recommendation is made by the BPDA board, which is then passed to the city council. The city council then can vote, and then it goes to the zoning commission before being incorporated into zoning.
Okay, and then does the technical advisory group have the capacity to write a report, or is that enshrined in their powers? No.
No.
Okay. Will the administration be before the council again the next 6 or 12 months regarding allocation of IDP funds? I know that, Rick, you mentioned this was based on, this is actually money not that's sitting in the bank, it's money that we're projecting. Will there be another round of this in the next 6 to 12 months?
So we have been coming back to the city council every year or two requesting the accept and expend authority and IDP funds. We're happy to, we can share at any time if you want to see the list of projects that we have committed to and are expecting, the pipeline of projects as well. We're happy to share that, but we probably normally wouldn't be coming back for another year or two.
I ask this because the projections that you have given are based on an IDP that is based on the 13%, right? And so I'm wondering, what does that look like? I don't know what I don't know if you gave us a timeline. You told us things are happening, but like, what is a timeline? And I guess this is both of you, for when we can expect those numbers so that we can see how the shifts and the numbers presented today, what that would look like.
Right. Well, I would have to say that in 2015, when the policy was last changed, and when I started working with the IDP at the city, one thing that we really instilled in our efforts was that units should be on site.
Right.
And so when units are on site, we don't get funds for the IDP fund except for these small partial unit payments. And we anticipate we've heard loud and clear that is a continued priority for most of our communities to have units on site, which means that over time, the amount of funding we might get from the IDP towards housing and that would come directly to MOH is actually forecast to decline over time.
There could be a seesaw effect, right? Because if the percentage goes up and the amount, like the allocation that developers are,
It depends on whether projects are if projects are giving us money instead of doing the units on site.
But I'm just saying that there could be a scenario where there are fewer offsites, but we're still capturing more revenue based on how we increase the IDP numbers.
I mean, it's possible, but I think in the long run, we're looking at a situation where much more of the funding is kept within the buildings itself.
Okay.
So, yeah.
But that's a great point, and I think, as the kind of conversations and methodology in the report of the IDP policy unfolds, I think we will be looking at that. What is the impact on the funds? What is the impact on on-site and off-site units? And we can report back on that.
Thank you. Tim, you mentioned that there is a true-up in the IDP policy. Are we always able to go back to developer and actually get that true-up?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Is there ever a true down, the reverse of that? Does that ever happen?
No, because it's a minimum payment.
Right.
So the minimum payment is based on the same number we use for rental units. So if it's a downtown unit, we would expect $380,000 per unit. That's the minimum payment. So it never goes below that. So although the number, if you did a true-up, you could find that situation, but because of the minimum, we would always get that, at least that $380,000 per unit.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. And so just so that, just to be clear for the record, on the codification of IDP, on the timeline, we're looking at maybe
Towards the end of the year.
towards the end of the year?
Yeah.
Okay. And then, last question is, actually, this is in regard to the ARP. It says that in regards to qualifying populations of the home ARP, it says other populations do not qualify under any of the populations above, but meet one of the following criteria: other families requiring services or housing distance to prevent homelessness, B, those at greatest risk of housing instability. And I'm just wondering if these funds could be used for example, for migrants who may be difficult to house, who may not have the documentation needed to access other forms of housing.
I'd have to check on the documentation issue, but certainly it can be used for those kind of populations. And also, although they're not called out specifically, returning citizens would be eligible.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, I think, we heard Councilor loud and clear from our budget hearing and the ARPA hearing, the importance of returning citizens and providing housing solutions for them. So I think between the operating budget, ARPA funding, I think we're happy to continue working with you in the Office of Returning Citizens to make sure we're addressing that need.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that because there is a lot of interest, and there's also a lot of interest in housing folks who are transitory, are migrant populations who are underdocumented, mixed income, mixed status households, which is also why I think the city-based voucher program is a great one to support because there are less requirements under than federal and state regulations. So I know there's a loud number of us on the city council who care about that as well and making sure that we're funding that as much as we can. So I think that does it with my questions, unless there are more questions you want me to ask. But I think those are my questions, and I took this as an opportunity myself to ask questions that we sometimes have on the council. I know that there's a lot of energy both here and in the community to see what this administration is doing on the inclusionary development policy when it comes to increasing the threshold, when it comes to decreasing the AMI to make it really reflect Boston-based AMI. To make sure that we are supporting our residents once they are in IDP properties to make sure that the buildings are culturally sensitive. So I commend the work that the administration is doing, and also our role is to hold the administration accountable to make sure it's responsive to what the community is asking for. So I thank you for attending this administration. I'm really excited about the possibility in these grants that, especially with the ARP grant. That is our first time hearing about it. Love when we have new sources of funding from the federal government, which is often rare, unfortunately, when it comes to housing, so I appreciate that. I'm just going to note that we have received 2 absentee letters that should have happened in the beginning of the hearing, but one from the chair of the Housing and Community Development, Kendra Lara, who is not able to make it, but who is excited about supporting these funds in the council, and also from Councilor at Large Erin Murphy, who is not able to make it, but has staff members listening in. So I thank you for your time and for being here, and wish everyone a good day. Happy Juneteenth weekend. And I know that a lot of the firefighters today, we are remembering the Vendome fire from 1972. So just remembering the firefighters, who it was the deadliest fire in the city, in the city's history. So just want to make sure we keep those firefighters in mind today. So thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you, Counselor.
Meeting is adjourned.